So let me just muse on this with you with these 7 elements as if I was in a situation and what I would do and how I would think through what my role would be and how I should try to become an enduring activist. So take the first one, vacuum. I think with a vacuum, everyone has to play their part in shrinking it. That's the one element that everybody has to engage with. So let's look at this perhaps in an example. Let's imagine I'm in a city where the government and protesters are facing off against each other, kind of like Hong Kong in the past few years. So the first task is always, where's the vacuum? What's the power deflation that is fueling this situation? Because remember, think always of the vacuum as the place where extremists triumph only if moderates fail. Now, in this particular city I'm thinking of, on the government side, the attitude is that we need to deploy overwhelming, violent force to suppress the protesters. That's an extreme position. It's given up on all moderation. But you can also get this extremism on the protester side as well, where they would say, the only way to respond to this is to be more violent. Now, if those two extremes entrench, then a vacuum is created and the result is a bloodbath. So that's my first cue. What do I do to stop this vacuum opening up? How do I work to create a space for non-violent protest to dialogue with a government that is committed to using non-violent means? That's the only way forward. That's it. That's why I have to link up with others. So I would be working at that and going to the protesters and trying to ensure that the government and the protesters got together and committed themselves to dialogue. There is a very important book, actually, that's written about activism in a dictatorial context, because a lot of this is really about what happens in democracies. But there's a very important book by Gene Sharp. It's called From Dictatorship to Democracy. And it was a kind of Bible for the pro-democracy movements in Eastern Europe. And Gene Sharp points out two absolutely important reasons why violence never works for protesters. This is how he puts it. He says, by placing confidence in violent means, one has chosen the very type of struggle with which the oppressors nearly always have superiority. Protesters are never going to win against a mighty government that's itching to send troops onto the streets. You're playing their game. Secondly, though, he says, this is why non-violence is much stronger, because it has the capacity to unite the entire society against the oppressor. You need protesters to command wide assent in all the sectors of society. But if protest becomes violent, most people won't join the movement. This is what Sharp says. Non-violent struggle is a much more complex and varied means of struggle than is violence. Instead, the struggle is fought by psychological, social, economic, and political weapons applied by the populations and the institutions of the society. So whatever we do to bolster the forces of moderation in the situation, we are helping to shrink the vacuum. If that vacuum is properly shrunk, or in this case not allowed to develop at all, terrible oppression simply cannot be unleashed. Or if it is, it cannot be sustained. So everyone has a role in that. Then you look at the individual elements. Who's the villain? Is it the leader, perhaps, who is sanctioning levels of violence against the protesters? Or their political bosses as well? They might be in another city or they might be in another country. But also sometimes you can get villains among protesters who might spread the view that only violence will work, and they will split the movement if they succeed. So, can you get to these villains? Who do we have to support to make sure that a moderate voice gets into their ear? If I was involved in politics, it would be my particular role, for example, to be a voice to the villain. Because usually, you're in their social circle a lot of the time. Then what about movement? Protest movements very often grow significantly from the youth of the city. But the Gene Sharp principle is very relevant here because he talks about spreading responsibility. During a campaign for change, you have to keep shifting the burden to other groups in the population. If you leave it only to, for example, the students, they will burn out and be defeated. You spread the movement, though, to churches, to unions, to other civic groups, and so the burden of defiance can be shared and spread, and that ensures that the movement has resilience and can last for as long as is needed. So you ask, well, what part of all these groups do I have to link up with? Lies. What are the lies being told? One is usually told by the government. We can only protect the citizens and the prosperity of the city if we crack down hard on all the protesters and stick them in jail. That's a lie. Because the best way to deal with protesters is to talk to them. The best way to preserve the prosperity of a city is to keep it free. Now, there might be other lies too, though, from the other side, from the protesters. All police are thugs. I'm sure that's not true. And if I was a minister in a church, this would be a critical area of engagement. You would need to come against those lies with the authority of Scripture. Mobs. Do mobs play a role? Governments often use mobs to beat up protesters, and they hope to intimidate and frighten anyone who's less committed from joining the movement. And sometimes the protesters have to watch and not be goaded into too much violence. Sometimes government members infiltrate into the ranks of protesters and they egg on the protesters to commit nasty acts that will lose them the respect of the community. Remember, mobs are never spontaneous. So if I was, for example, a journalist in that setting, I would be seeking to expose those tactics. Megaphone, there's always a narrative that, for example, officially would dismiss protesters, something like, it's only foreign elements that are inciting the protesters to paralyze the city, and no mention would be made of legitimate grievances. That has to be come against. Laws. The danger is that laws can get passed ostensibly to keep public order, but they could stay on the statute book to prevent dissent in the future. And this is where legislatures and lobbyists come into their own. And they need help to challenge and change unjust laws. So everybody needs to do a diagnosis of what's going on in their situation according to the 7 elements and work through those discernment questions. Now, of course, there'll be future tactical work to be done. But this will get us to our first faithful step. And if we take that step in response to God's invitation and walk in step with others, we are on our way to becoming an enduring activist. And an enduring activist is a prevailing activist. In the end, it may take a long time, just as it took God many ages to bring salvation to us.